Hello, my name is David Ansara of the Center for Risk Analysis. I'm here with your weekly bulletin from the CRA, and I'm delighted to be joined by two analysts from the CRA team, my colleagues Nicholas Babaya and Bheki Mahlobo. And we thought we would use this opportunity just to provide some feedback on current trends and developments, both in South Africa and in the world. We are South Africa focused, but we also look at international trends as well. So a couple of issues that arose from queries that we had from our clients this week that we thought we'd profile. So the first is South Africa's current COVID-19 trajectory. And in our risk alert, which we release on a Monday morning, we said that by our analysis, it looks as if new daily infection numbers have peaked over the last week, and the reproductive number, or R, in South Africa is now below 1. And Bheki is going to be showing us some data just on how that calculation is made and some of the implications and the significance of that. We argue in our alert that if R is sustained below 1, then that is good news for South Africa's prospects of reopening into the spring. Now, the second issue is the US elections. We're now under 100 days away from the presidential elections to be held in November. And so Bheki and Nicholas are going to be just exploring some of the data from our election poll tracker, which looks in granular detail at some of the trends in the electoral cycle in the US. All right, I'm going to hand over to Bheki, who's going to take us through our calculation of R and some of the significance of this new development that South Africa's R is under 1.
Thank you, David. So essentially the topic that will be in the media as well as individuals' mind is whether has South Africa reached its peak in August. And for that, we at the center look at an indicator called the R estimate. We at the center calculate the R estimate as taking the daily new infections of this week divided by the daily new infections of last week. And what R tells us is it is the reproductive value of the virus. And if R is above 1, and we've represented 1 as this black line that you can see on your left-hand side across your right-hand side of the screen. And if it is above 1, which you can see in June as well as July, it means that the spread of the virus is increasing. And if it is below 1, it means that the spread of the virus is decreasing, which you can see here in late July and early August. Now, this is good news for South Africa, as this means that if R is below 1 for one more week or sustainable period, then it means that South Africa has reached its peak, and we could see significant reopening of the economy towards spring in September. Now, we have to alert the clients that in order for R to be an accurate indicator, we need to have a consistent number of tests conducted daily, as well as the infections rate. And what we have noticed is that during the weekends, there's a sudden dip in testing data. Now, we at the center have taken this into account, and we are fairly conservative in our calculation of R, and we are hopeful that the R estimate will be below 1 in the coming weeks ahead, which would mean great opening in September.
All right, thanks, Bheki. I think that that's very interesting indeed and very encouraging. Obviously, there are some caveats there, as you mentioned. The quality of the testing data is really critical. Nicholas, do you want to add anything to what Bheki has just presented here?
Yes, I think what I'll say is that if you have seen the R calculation in a couple of the CRA's slideshows in the briefings a couple of months ago, they may have looked extremely erratic. But since then, the testing has really improved in South Africa up to the extent that we can calculate an R number with a good amount of certainty. And even being very conservative and taking into account the large dip in the number of tests conducted over the weekend, I think the way things are looking is that South Africa is definitely past its peak, and the virus will be on the decline after this.
And I think what's interesting to observe is when you look at many countries around the world, when there are dips below 1, it is very unlikely that the R estimate will then go above 1 subsequently. I think there's only been one country, Argentina, that has experienced that, going above 1 after having dipped. So part of what we are commenting on in terms of the infection numbers in our briefings is that this idea, this thesis of the second wave, there doesn't seem to be much empirical evidence for it. And there is a narrative in the mainstream press around second waves in Europe, the so-called second wave in America. That seems to be more the trajectory of the virus passing through various regions, also improvements in the quality and frequency of testing. The US is far and away the most frequent tester. All right, well, I think that covers it for this topic, but if you CRA clients would like to discuss this further, we'd be happy to arrange a call or even a formal briefing on this subject. Do get in touch with us. The links are in the description below. Let's move on now to developments in the United States. Joe Biden seems to be enjoying a healthy lead in the polls. But when you look a bit more closely, the picture is more complex, particularly dynamics within the swing states. These are mostly blue-collar industrial states or Rust Belt states that tend to swing in terms of their voter support, and which was so critical during the 2016 elections. And Nicholas, you've prepared some data here showcasing some of the polling and also reflecting some of our own data from our election tracker. Won't you please take us through some of your analysis here?
Yes, thanks very much, David. At the moment, the polling is really not looking good for Donald Trump. Right now, he's trailing in quite a large number of states to Joe Biden, and in many cases, it's not even close. But something that needs to be remembered about Donald Trump, and especially his supporters, is that quite often the polling is very wrong. And in 2016, we all know what happened. Nobody expected him to win. But at the end of the day, a lot of the polling was wrong, and that's because Trump supporters are just very difficult to poll. Sometimes they're a little bit shy about mentioning their support to pollsters on the phone or various other reasons. So for this reason, we've actually been very conservative in our estimates here. We've given any states within a 5-point margin where Joe Biden is leading the polling by about 5 points, we've given them to Donald Trump, particularly. So we have also exercised a bit of discretion depending on what state it is and the sort of voting patterns in that state. So for example, no one expected Trump to win Wisconsin in the last election, but that did happen. So we've taken into account, especially the politics around these regions. One of Joe Biden's strengths, arguably, in this election is the fact that he's from a working class background, born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, grew up in Delaware, and that gets him very much in tune, and it may gain him a large amount of support among industrial workers, blue-collar workers in the Rust Belt states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, all of which are key for any presidential candidate to win and have been in most US presidential races. Bheki, if you'll press for the next animation, we can see right here the electoral college votes, which are not swing states. Those are the ones that usually stay the same. Nothing new there. However, if you go look at the polling for the electoral votes in the swing states, Joe Biden is really leading by a significant amount. And many of these swing states, it should be noted, are actually these blue-collar workers in the Rust Belt, Pennsylvania down at the bottom there, and Michigan up at the top. So depending on Biden's strength in these states, could really cause him to do very well in the election. I'd like to bring also your attention now to Florida. Florida is notoriously a difficult state to poll in US elections, and it often comes down to a very, very close race in Florida, which is usually very, very consequential. We think by looking at the polls, Florida still remains competitive. Biden is still leading in the polling there, but not by as much as the other states. And so this election, if it comes down to the wire, it may all come down to Florida, as has been the case a few times before that. But it should also be noted that still a long time until the election happens in November, and there's plenty that can happen, even up to as close as a week or two outside of the election, that can seriously sway the polls one way or another. So that should be kept in mind whenever reading predictions about the elections.
Yeah, and as you noted earlier, Nicholas, this phenomenon of shy Trump supporters, particularly given the level of political polarization that now exists in the United States, I think that one must proceed with a bit of caution when looking at these polling numbers, not necessarily take them at face value. And we saw polling companies getting it wrong in terms of the Brexit vote in the UK, 2016 vote. So, I think a healthy degree of skepticism is warranted there. And I think something that will be interesting to note is whether there will actually be a debate between President Trump and Mr. Biden. And a lot has been made about Mr. Biden's ability to fend off the rather belligerent kind of attacks that characterize a typical Trump debate. So it'll be interesting to observe whether that actually goes ahead and in what kind of format. What do you think the prospects of that are, Nicholas?
Yeah, I think the way the US has reacted to the pandemic and the sort of lockdown restrictions that they've imposed, if you were to ask me, I think there would probably still be a presidential debate. The Democratic primary debates still continued. They just didn't have an audience. And in any case, US presidential debates are usually kept silent. They usually allow for applause at the beginning and the end, but they actually ask the crowd to be quiet during the process. I think that when the debates come around, although debates have historically not had an enormous swing on polling and election outcomes, according to some experts, the problem is that Trump really does have the gift of the gab, as much as some people may think he talks like a person who's very immature. When it comes to vocal fighting, he's extremely good. And Joe Biden, unfortunately, says gaffes all too common and quite often embarrasses himself just by saying the wrong thing. So, in terms of who's got the silver tongue, it may be that Donald Trump really gains an advantage by having those debates. And it should not be underestimated as well, the number of people in America that watch those debates. It really is, as my one American colleague said to me, it's like the Super Bowl of politics. So yeah, certainly that could have an opinion. I think that will happen, if you were to ask me that.
Okay, Nick, well, thanks very much. I think on that note, we'll leave it there. If you would like more of this kind of analysis, please do get in touch with us and we'd be happy to brief you more closely. And also do keep a lookout for an invitation to a briefing by Frans Cronje next week. That's exclusively to CRA clients. We'll be hosting a session where you will be able to see his latest analysis on this and other topics. And that's it from us, from the CRA team for this week. Join us next week for another update.